So welcome everybody to today's webinar. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. So welcome to everyone from wherever you are joining to our exciting webinar on adopting a standardized approach to biodiversity reporting. My name is Annika Liljestam, and I'm delighted to moderate today's webinar on behalf of GINGR. So as you all know, as we accelerate with renewables and grid expansion on a global scale, there are a lot of expectations today around environmental reporting, and these are just rising quickly. So we need to move forward with this topic. This is why GINGR has decided to work on this topic. And we would like to bring some clarity into this field today. So what does good biodiversity reporting look like? Where are the gaps, and how can we move from compliance-driven monitoring reporting towards something more strategic, more aligned? Before we start, I would just like to quickly share some housekeeping rules. If you can, it's always nice to see your faces if your Wi-Fi allows this, but please have the microphone off. It would also be nice to see your name and your organization. If you have questions, we have a Q&A session later on. Then you can ask your questions during the Q&A. And as I already said, we are recording, so this is available for people afterwards as well. If you feel like it would also be very interesting for GINGR to know from where you are dialing into. Please write your institution and country of residence or work into the chat, so we have an idea of the audience that we're dealing with today. This would be very helpful. I would just quickly like to introduce our two speakers here today. So we have my colleague Rachel Asante-Owusu from IUCN. Hi, Rachel. Happy to see you. She's a senior program coordinator in the Climate Change and Energy Transition Unit at IUCN. And then we have Dr. Stefanoudis from the Biodiversity Consultancy based in the UK. And Paris is actually the lead author of the report that this webinar is actually based on. We are just giving a quick look at today's agenda. So I make this very quick to tell you also what GINGR is about. Then Rachel will give us a brief introduction and make the connection to why this topic is currently very important for us. And then Paris will give an insight into the report. And then you have a lot of time for questions, and hopefully we will also give you the answers that you're looking for. Until then, and at the end, we do a wrap up. So you might have heard of GINGR, or you might not have heard of GINGR. We are an initiative co-organized by IUCN and the Renewables Grid Initiative based in Berlin. And within GINGR, we aim to support the just and sustainable energy transition. And we want to provide assessment tools to quantify contributions to nature positive and people positive goals. So in the long run, what we intend to do is to develop a monitoring and reporting framework that is aligned and standardized on a global level. And we want to report on progress towards biodiversity gains and community benefits when deploying renewables. And with this, we mean wind, solar, and grids as well. GINGR wants to support governments, the renewable energy industry, and the financial sector. And we all want to support that these achieve the energy and climate and biodiversity targets in a timely manner. If you want to learn more about GINGR, please have a look at our webpage. This is just a very brief introduction, but of course we have a lot more to offer. We have publications online. We have a lot more webinars to look at. Yes, just stay tuned on what we're doing. And now I am handing over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Annika. Thank you, Annika. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I know that if your working week is anything like mine, it's very busy. So we do appreciate the fact that you've taken an hour out of your schedule to come and join us and talk about this report. And in fact, we have a very interesting webinar today, which is based on a really in-depth and fascinating report around monitoring biodiversity impacts and dependencies. So I'm not going to spend too long setting the scene, which will allow us a little bit more time to dive into the substance of the report, which I think everybody's going to find really quite fascinating. So let me start by really taking a step back and describing why we think this work is so important and so crucial within the GINGR working group and GINGR family. We recognise at the minute that there is a real broad-based consensus that the world must move rapidly towards renewable energy if we are to meet our climate goals. The science around this is clear, and the urgency around it is also undeniable. And the encouraging news is that over the past few years, we've really seen this happening on the ground. So last year, there was globally a record 600 gigawatts of solar capacity added. And that is roughly equivalent to all the solar capacity that was installed pre-2020. And it's also a 32% increase compared to the year before. Again, with the wind industry, last year we had 117 gigawatts of new capacity installed, bringing the total global wind power to more than 1,100 gigawatts. And the installation of turbines is really growing globally. So 55 countries across the globe have now installed wind turbine and are using wind power. And the growth in renewables is far from over. So when we look at projected growth, there's another 48 gigawatts of offshore growth that's already currently under construction worldwide. And industry forecasts that an annual growth of around 21% will be seen over the next decade, with an additional something like 350 gigawatts expected between 2025 and 2030. And the underpinning of all this renewable energy generation means that we need to have a grid infrastructure that follows this growth as well. And this we are also seeing with increasing deployment and investment within the grid sector. This reached 370 billion in 2024, and projections are that the final figure for 2025 will exceed $470 billion, marking a double-digit growth for the second consecutive year. Now, whilst all this is clearly good news for climate action and for meeting our climate targets, at GINGR, we believe that the transition to renewable energy will not achieve its climate goals without also ensuring that nature loss is not only halted, but is also reversed. In other words, to successfully respond to the climate crisis, we must deliver a nature-positive future. And all sectors, including the renewable energy sector, have to contribute towards this delivery of nature positive. And in a nutshell, that's the challenge at the heart of this report that we're about to discuss. So GINGR commissioned the Biodiversity Consultancy. That's a bit of a mouthful. I'm going to call them TBC from now on. So we asked TBC to review how the renewables and grid sector are currently reporting on their impacts and dependencies on nature. And the report asks some fundamental questions. What reporting frameworks exist today? Where are the gaps? How are we currently reporting on practices that align with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which sets out the world's vision for a nature-positive future? And crucially, how do we support the renewable energy and grid sector to implement monitoring and reporting on nature-positive contributions without unnecessarily increasing the reporting requirements, which some companies already report back to us are very, very heavy. So within the report, we found that there's both encouraging and sobering news. On the encouraging side, there's genuine momentum. Regulatory frameworks, particularly those within the European Union, are beginning to create real accountability. We have corporate reporting that's evolving, with many companies increasingly examining impacts across their supply chains and beginning to set science-based targets for nature. Within the financial sector, multilateral development banks and lenders adopting equator principles are also driving meaningful standards, especially in markets where regulation may be less developed. So these emerging markets in terms of renewable energy generation and distribution. Across both the industry and finance, there's now growing recognition that biodiversity risk is business risk and cannot be easily extrapolated. I'm not going to go into more of the findings because I think that's why Paris and the TBC team are here, but I will I'll leave it to them to give us a greater insight into the findings of the report. But maybe I'll finish by saying a really sincere thank you to TBC for their fantastic work in developing this report. I think there's a lot more that we'll be doing on the basis of the report, but for now, I'll hand it back to Annika and to our TBC colleagues to go into depth. Thank you so much, Annika.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Thanks for grounding us in the bigger picture here. So I would actually like to hand over directly to Paris, so we save some time. So we now basically move from why are we doing this to how are we doing this? And Paris has been very busy with TBC to look at the 32 biodiversity-related frameworks and different standards. So just a quick note, and we will share the link later. There is a new snapshot report of this report, like basically a summary on the GINGR webpage available. And we will share the link to this later, so you can also have a little bit of reading as a homework. So Paris, please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Annika, and thanks, Rachel. So welcome all from me as well. Thank you for joining this webinar. We really appreciate your time. So here we will give a concise sort of overview of the biodiversity and nature-related reporting landscape for the renewables and grid sector based on the report that was commissioned by GINGR. I was the lead author, but I also have colleagues here with me in this webinar, Angus Cook, Lauren Weatherden, and Shannon Westphal, which contributed to this report as well. So the aim is here to show you a snapshot of what is working well, where it is inconsistent, how the sector can move forward towards a nature-positive future, and we welcome any feedback during the discussion section and on this webinar. So we reviewed 32 frameworks and standards. So they were, some of them were from the EU, others were from the UK and France, but a lot of them were international. So they covered a wide range of types of frameworks. So some of them were regulatory, others were voluntary, others were lender-driven. And we did that in order to try and understand how these address 5 priority environmental topics, which are sort of quite important for the renewable sector. These were marine biodiversity, seabed impacts, habitat fragmentation, species monitoring, supply chain environmental footprint, emissions and net zero, and then construction and operational ecosystem impacts. So during our analysis, we tried to see how these frameworks and standards were actually addressing those issues which are of importance to the renewable sector. And at the same time, we had a second layer of assessment. We tried also to see how these frameworks also aligned with the global nature positive ambitions, specifically the targets from the Global Biodiversity Framework. So from our analysis, we saw that coverage varied significantly across the different 5 sort of environmental issues. So there was some strong coverage around marine biodiversity, habitats and species, and site-based impacts. This was sort of reflected in EU directives, for example, the Birds and Habitats Directive or the Marine Framework Directive. And then also from lender standards like IFC PS6 for site-based impacts, also the ADB, which is the Asian Development Bank ESS6 standard, was also quite relevant. And then there was also sort of partial sort of coverage from TNFD on some of these topics. When it came to supply chain, there was less of a good coverage across the different frameworks, but it is sort of there is momentum on that. So there are sort of a lot of voluntary frameworks applicable globally, like for example TNFD or GRI, so the Global Reporting Initiative and the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. A lot of acronyms, apologies for that. And then in the EU, there is also the CSRD, ESRS, specifically E4, which focuses on biodiversity. So these ones do take into account supply chain impacts, so further upstream rather than on the site where a project is being taking place. And finally, when it comes to emissions, there was partial coverage. So that is, there were specific frameworks specifically looking just at that. So it wasn't necessarily connected well with biodiversity. So you have things like SBTI or TCFD. And then in the EU, you have CSRD, specifically ESRS E1, which specifically focuses on climate change. So overall, that sort of show that frameworks differ in how clearly, in how they address all these different impacts, which are of importance to the renewable sector. So on this slide here, we can see this table. What it tries to show is how the different frameworks, and these are just some of the 32, align with the different priority topics. So if you have a sort of dark blue cell, that means there is a good alignment. If it's a light blue, there is partial alignment, and then if it's plain background white, then that means that it's not covered at all. So just focusing specifically on and when we highlighted something in red is where the actual it's a good example of how these align. So this is why we're focusing here on, for example, on EU directives, and we found that in Europe, biodiversity regulation is particularly robust, as Rachel also alluded to, which leads to conservation of marine ecosystems and biodiversity. So some examples, for example, the EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive, or MSFD, it adopts an ecosystem-based approach. So it sets objectives for good environmental status across marine waters, and then member states must implement mechanisms through marine spatial plans and permitting processes. Now, for companies in the renewables and grid sector, they might not necessarily report directly under MSFD, but the rules and targets to which offshore renewable developers, for example, must align may be linked to MSFD. So a lot of the requirements on baseline service and monitoring are sort of aligned with MSFD descriptors. So this is how it sort of helps the sector around marine biodiversity. And then complementing the MSFD are the EU Birds and Habitat Directives. So there are the species and habitat specific layer. So what they do is they sort of have targeted protection for priority species and habitats, which in turn strengthens the outcomes of MSFD. They achieve this through by focusing on restoring or maintaining habitats and trying to get a good conservation status of species. So essentially, they're quite good at maintaining connectivity and preventing habitat fragmentation. So this is one example of how this works well from a regulatory perspective. And another example is IFC-PS6 from the lender standards. Most of you will be familiar, but the IFC-PS6 is a globally applicable sort of biome agnostic. So it's relevant also for the marine environment standard, which adopts the mitigation hierarchy. So it requires avoidance and minimization of impacts, including seabed and critical habitats. It has some alignment with the EU Habitats Directive in the sense that it also covers habitat fragmentation and species monitoring. So globally, it's a benchmark for critical habitat classification, and it is being used by a lot of developers. And it also adopts a sort of landscape, seascape level analysis, which means that projects must assess their impacts not just on the side of operations, but also around that. So it includes elements of marine connectivity and ecological processes as well. Sort of looking at the reporting landscape from a sort of regional sort of lens, we noticed, as I already sort of alluded to, that Europe sort of has consistent and prescriptive directives, which like CSRD, SFDR, the Birds and Habitat directives, and so forth, which establishes a very robust foundation when it comes to compliance and transparency. And looking at other parts of the globe, for example, in global emerging markets, there is a strong reliance on development finance standards, for example, IFC-PS6, which we just mentioned, or ADB ESS6, the Equator Principles, and this is particularly relevant for example, for parts of the Asia Pacific or Latin America and parts of Africa. And then, of course, we also have in those regions, well, globally, but also in those regions, we have the voluntary frameworks like TNFD, GRI, SPTN, and so forth, which can play a critical role occasionally in supplementing regulatory requirements in some regions. And it enables companies to demonstrate leadership and fill gaps where there are gaps in the national policy, for example, or where perhaps maybe the national policy is less prescriptive. However, the adoption and impact of these frameworks can vary widely. So, and that sort of reflects sort of market maturity, policy priorities, and technical capacity. So on the lender standards, we just sort of touched upon and how they can be quite important in particular parts of the globe. In general, finance increasingly, we see that it starts shaping biodiversity practice, and it does it in three different ways. First of all, it creates sort of the technical evidence base through which requirements because of the requirements for surveys and monitoring. It also promotes transparency, for example, thinking about the Equator Principles. They require often independent reviews and monitoring, and also encourage sharing biodiversity data. So there is some transparency that finance brings into the biodiversity space. And then in some cases, they can also shape national policies as well. For example, projects in Mozambique follow sort of quite strict biodiversity requirement nowadays, which are quite consistent with IFC PS6 requirements. So this is one example where sort of lender standards could have an influence on national policies as well. So overall, what this shows is that finance can and will probably increasingly shape biodiversity practice in the future, and it can be quite sort of powerful when it comes to nature positive action. So this was trying to see how the first part of the report was to try and see how it aligns with the different environmental topics that we just mentioned. And then the next part tried to focus on how the frameworks align with GBF's global targets. So overall, we found that there are some targets which are actually quite well sort of represented in the existing reporting landscape, but there are also critical gaps. So thinking about what is actually quite well covered in existing frameworks and standards is, for example, targets around business disclosure and governance, which is target 14 and 15. So these were the ones most frequently addressed. But there are also quite good coverage on ecological targets, thinking about sort of protection and spatial planning, which is target 1, ecosystem restoration, pollution reduction are increasingly be considered by reporting landscapes. So conversely, when it came to things that were not necessarily so well covered or were partially covered, so species extinction and invasive species, they are covered, but maybe not explicitly so. And there are good reasons for that. Some of them, for example, on invasive species are quite tricky, perhaps, to sort of try and address that in a framework and report on it. But for some other targets, like nature contributions to people, for example, target 11, or resource mobilization, there was very little, if almost no coverage in the existing reporting landscape. And this all is sort of being summarized on this figure. I guess focusing on the ones highlighted in red are the frameworks and standards that have quite a big range of GBF target coverage. And this includes EU CSRD or IFC PS6, GRI 101, which focuses on biodiversity, and TNFD. So these have the greatest alignment with GBF targets. Again, we follow like a similar sort of color palette here. Sort of dark blue is good alignment, and then no alignment is plain background. So just focusing on one example, it's too much to go through it. But for example, IFC PS6, it has quite good direct alignment with sort of ecological targets like spatial planning, protection, and restoration. And it has indirect alignment with some of the other targets, for example, on conservation, invasive species, for example, pollution or climate change. And then from the voluntary frameworks, TNFD is one that has quite a strong alignment or quite a wide range of alignment with different GBF targets. So the previous slide indicated where there are gaps in GBF alignment with the different frameworks. But this slide focuses a little bit more on the 5 priority issues that we identified in the first part of the report. We just wanted to see which GBF targets are actually, because not all the gaps are necessarily as important. So some GBF targets are more important for the sector. So thinking about, for example, marine biodiversity, ecosystem GBF targets 1 to 4, which are very ecology orientated, are very important when we're thinking about habitats and species, and the fact that transmission lines, for example, can fragment habitats. GBF targets 3, which relates to conservation, or 4, which relates to species extinction, become quite important. Because infrastructure can aid also invasive species spread, GBF target 6 on invasive species is quite important when we think about this particular topic. On supply chain, because the renewables and grid sector use a lot of materials and rare earths, which can drive biodiversity loss further upstream, and the impacts sit often outside of project boundaries, then GBF targets 15 and 18 are quite important here, which have a more holistic overview of the supply chain. And then when it comes to emissions, the GBF targets 8 is quite important, the one relating to climate change. And finally, thinking about construction and operational impacts, a lot of the targets that relate to marine biodiversity and habitat species are covered here, but maybe some others are included here as well, especially around nature contributions to people, for example, is also relevant in this particular scenario. So these were the analysis, based on a desktop review and expert knowledge, but we also wanted to get some feedback from stakeholders. So we did targeted interviews, and there was also a roundtable that GINGR led in the IUCN Congress in Abu Dhabi last year. So and that helped us really try and understand what the critical sort of challenges that companies face in this space. So a little bit on the composition of the interviews. So we interviewed 4 companies. They had all headquarters in Europe, but they had operations across the globe. Some of them in Asia, outside of Europe, in Asia Pacific region, and some of them had global operations. So it gave us a relatively broad overview of the challenges of sort of key players in this space. And what companies are doing, being active in EU, a lot of them, unsurprisingly, were had to report for CSRD. So that was a main sort of regulatory driver. But in terms of voluntary frameworks, a lot of frameworks that have been mentioned was TNFD, SBTI on climate, GRI and SBTN, and also CDP, which relates to climate as well. So what was interesting was also that depending on the company, some of them actually have developed internal tools, quite sophisticated internal tools, which were quite useful to aid reporting, but that we found out was more sort of the case for quite large companies, and smaller companies maybe with less resources did not have that opportunity. So some of the challenges that a lot of the companies, through all of the companies mentioned, was around data. So data remains scattered, it's inconsistent, and it's a little bit difficult to automate. It was a little bit easier for those that had internal tools, but overall, it's one sort of key challenge. The reporting burden was mentioned by a couple of companies, and this is specifically relevant for companies that are operating across multiple countries, for example, in the EU, and then EU directives are imprinted on national law a little bit differently. So they had to sort of navigate those differences across the different countries, and that sort of added to the reporting burden. Another common theme was nature positive confusion. So there was no consensus on definitions on what nature positive is, and what metrics should be used. I know there are efforts, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later, but overall, it seemed that people were not really sure of the definitions. And then cumulative impact, specifically thinking about offshore environments, was also mentioned by a couple of companies. There is little guidance on thresholds or methods, for example. And trying to link those, try to find commonalities between the industry's insights and the financial institutions' roundtable insights. So 2 things were sort of shared across both. One was around the lack of standardized indicators and metrics for biodiversity reporting, which I know GINGR already has a specific working group working on that. And then there is also the need to improve monitoring and data availability. Again, offshore sort of stood out in this case as well, and some further support in how to incorporate legacy data that have been collected a while ago. And two things that financial institutions specifically mentioned was around the need to move beyond compliance and also perhaps move towards incentive-based approaches, so that biodiversity credits were mentioned there, but also recognizing also the co-benefits, the social co-benefits, so that how these could be linked to nature positive efforts. So these insights, together with the results of the analysis that we have done, led us to sort of recommend that there is a strong need here to develop a nature positive roadmap for the sector. So the way this roadmap would look like is having a roadmap would provide clarity, because right now the reporting landscape is crowded. So it's really difficult to keep track of what each framework wants and doesn't want. And depending on which topic you're focusing on or is important for you, there is an uneven coverage depending on which framework you're operating with. We saw that alignment is partial for a lot of the GBF targets, especially for things linked to ecological outcomes, finance, or social dimensions. And because companies face high reporting pressure, they do lack consistent metrics and guidance, which makes the whole exercise a little bit more difficult. And both interviewees as well as the finance roundtable, sort of all the stakeholders agree that there is need for clarity, consistency, and practicality. There is not necessarily a need to have another framework that can sort of be an all-encompassing one. So how could this nature positive roadmap look like? We recommend that it could have four sort of key elements. One would be around standardizing nature-based terminology. So it would introduce a shared vocabulary for concepts like no-net loss, net gain, nature positive, obviously, which would be specifically tailored for the renewables and grid sector. So this would help to reduce ambiguity. It would help to improve comparability and lead to more consistent reporting for the sector. The second element would include how companies can build on existing frameworks to meet global biodiversity ambitions, specifically GBF targets, which would build on a lot of the findings that we presented on this report. It would also highlight best practices in the sector, so give examples of companies of how things could be done. And it could also expand further to incorporate additional country-specific approaches, because we appreciate that a lot of the frameworks are more sort of globally applicable or maybe EU-focused. So having additional information from other regions or specific countries would make this exercise more complete. And also, it would be good to provide companies with how to address underrepresented targets, specifically targets 11 and 19 that we mentioned previously. So the third element would be around providing guidance on persistent challenges that have been consistently identified. Biodiversity metrics and indicators was one. Cumulative impact assessments, especially on offshore, sensitivity mapping, and how to handle legacy data. Now, there is no necessarily need to sort of reinvent the wheel and start creating new guidance, but what would be perhaps quite useful would be to provide a review of existing resources which tackle those issues, and perhaps signpost where there are gaps still, where there are gaps that need further development. That could be quite a useful place to start. And then last but not least, the fourth element would be around engagement and uptake. So if a continuous consultation across industry and finance would really help making sure that this nature positive roadmap would be actually relevant for the sector. Since it would be globally applicable, translating into multiple languages would also help to ensure there is more uptake, perhaps in countries where English is not the first language. And then there could be a consideration to start a regional rollout first and then expand progressively into other locations and update the roadmap based on lessons learned. So this would ensure that the roadmap would be a living almost document, if you like, and it would be updated when new developments arose. So overall, and sort of concluding this part of my talk, would be that the suggested roadmap would work quite well, we believe, first of all, because it would align quite well with GINGR's principles, which is to provide aligned guidance. So it would align with frameworks, it would be additive, so it would build on top of existing frameworks, and it would be quite actionable as well. So it would give clear guidelines on what companies could do to move towards an nature positive future. It is quite flexible, so it can be enhanced over time as we have new developments and new science informing policy. And each element that we identified here responds directly to some of the challenges that we identified, but were also identified by stakeholder insights as well. And overall, all of these elements of the roadmap would help the sector move towards an ASA positive future. I think that's all from my side. I'm going to pass on back to Annika.
Thanks, Paris. Thanks so much for all this input. I'm pretty sure people have steaming heads now from all the abbreviations, and I hope there are a lot of questions. I've already seen there is one follow-up question, which I think might be helpful to clarify before we start the major Q&A. It's from Marcella. Marcella, you can also jump in and ask directly. So you're asking, does this alignment include the same indicators, the same methodologies, and the same terminology? I think there was sort of from in the beginning of the presentation, but I don't really know to which part of the slide this was then targeted.
I'm not sure as well what particular section of the report that was. Where can we see the questions on?
It was
Good afternoon. May I?
Yes, please.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
First of all, thank you very much, Marcela Mantilla from RT, the French TSO. So thank you for the presentation. I understood that more of when you present the different frameworks that exist, not only in terms of directives, in terms of initiatives for like GRI and TNFD. You mentioned, okay, at the end, they are consistent regarding the whole impacts in biodiversity. But my question now is, are they using the same indicators, the same methodologies, the same terminology, or is just alignment about the impacts, general impacts, but not about the measures that they are using? This is my question. Thank you very much.
I mean, thank you for the question. So yes, I think it was the latter that you mentioned. So when it came to assessing how they align with a particular topic, for example, marine biodiversity, it was around the broad topic of marine biodiversity rather than just checking which metrics in particular they use. And again, this is also because there is inconsistency in terms of, for example, on metrics and indicators that they're using. So it was around the topic itself rather than the actual sort of methods that they're using.
Does this answer your question, Marcela?
Yes, and also it's about our need. If I may, what we need today. So we, as French TSO, we have a lot of actions in order to protect nature and biodiversity. We are not only trying to reduce our impacts, but also to try to make a positive contribution. But we are always having this topic about how to demonstrate this and how can we use all of these actions that we are taking together with our different stakeholders to show the positive impacts. And since the indicators are not the same using everywhere, they are not the same methodologies, we need to see, the positive impacts not only shown middle and long term. It is very hard. So this is something that we really need and we are looking forward, and that's why we are waiting. That's why we are looking forward for this initiative to try to shed light on what would be these indicators or methodologies, particularly for transmission system operators. This is something that really we're looking forward.
Thank you. Yeah, this is actually interesting. So, I mean, we are quite a small group for a webinar. So, if there are more people also from the industry here, it would be very interesting for us, and we can open the discussion very, very openly to hear from you, or also from the financial institution that might be taking part today. So, what is currently the most challenging part of biodiversity reporting for you? I mean, we have seen that in the EU, the regulation is quite robust, but also some experiences from other countries would be very interesting to hear, because as you've seen within GINGR, we want to move forward with this. We want to work on this, and we would really appreciate your inputs on this. So feel free to jump in, but now I think we can go to Gaius Kamperman's question. What do you think of the nature measurement protocol that is in development by NPI and WBCSD? that was announced at the latest COP. It seemed promising in creating consistency in standards. So the Nature Positive Initiative, I think you're talking about. Feel free to speak up if you want. Other than that, I would give Paris.
Yes, I think that's quite a good sort of question here. I think we as TPC have been involved in helping draft the terrestrial set of metrics for the Nature Positive Initiative. So we were sort of technical advisors there. So I think this is quite a promising initiative. It's still ongoing. I think right now, for example, they're working on freshwater and marine metrics. A lot of these will be the marine side of things will be quite relevant for offshore wind, for example. So using a sort of universal set of indicators would go a long way to measure nature positive. So definitely this is something that I'm sure GINGR is already sort of thinking about, and they have a specific working group which probably will try and have some alignment with that. I think we have here Angus, who's part of that working group, the metrics working group. I think Rachel, you might be part of that as well. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that. And yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paris. I'll just add that, as you say, we do have an offshore metrics group which is working on aligning metrics that are being used by the offshore wind sector, but also metrics that are being piloted with the aim of being used by the offshore wind sector, and how those metrics could be implemented in order to monitor and report on nature positive contributions. Regarding the NPI Alliance, IUCN is a key member, and we are working with the Alliance around the metrics that will be used for the metrics protocol that was announced earlier this year. And the aim is that those metrics will be generic, and the aim is that they will work across different sectors. And what we are aiming to do is to harness and really think about the renewable sector and the grid sector and say, okay, under the Nature Positive Alliance and under this broad protocol that's being developed by NPI and IUCN and other partners, what does that mean for different sectors? So we're currently working on that at the minute.
Thanks, Rachel. Does this help, guys, or other than that? So I would open the floor for more questions. I mean, I have some questions on my list as well, but obviously you are the target audience, and I can always ask Paris after this call. So Christine says, great presentation, Paris. Thank you. While corporate reporting against CSRD ESRS in its early days in terms of compliance, it is okay, but companies need to connect this to organizational strategy level. Yes, I guess this is, we would agree with this. Paris, do you, I mean, I was also thinking about this when listening to you. So, as you said, the reporting landscape is very fragmented, and also cumulative impacts remain poorly addressed. We have seen this in the report, particularly on offshore. I don't know if you want to dive a little bit deeper maybe into this, but what would credible cumulative impact reporting look like in your view, so that this can be more integrated even? I think you mentioned it quickly, but maybe...
Yeah, I guess this is a sort of quite a big topic, and one that has been identified by a lot of stakeholders that we interviewed, or that were part of the finance roundtable. So these are just some thoughts that I have, but and others feel free to chip in. But I think maybe things that could help make cumulative impact assessments more robust when it comes to especially offshore environments. It could be things like the need to look beyond national and regional boundaries, which a lot of companies maybe often do. But instead of looking at those, we need to shift to looking at the scales that are appropriate for the species that are being affected by that. So a lot of migratory species, for example, they have boundaries that are, that span across different nations, across different regions. So making sure that they're sort of ecologically relevant spatial scales, which would be one thing. I think another point to mention here is that there needs to be a sort of more strategic sort of overview of cumulative impact assessments, a coordinated view, if you like, whereby one developer would also take into account other developers operating in the same region, which would make then the cumulative impact assessment more relevant. Because I think right now maybe each one is trying to do it on their own, but obviously impacts in the same region from different developers will add to this cumulative impact assessment. And I think that was mentioned during the presentation, but I can expand a little bit. I think right now there is no clear sort of thresholds, no clear sort of ecological components that companies have to focus on. So more sort of, and there is some guidance existing out there, but I think maybe building on that and making sure that it's relevant for the sector would also help. But it's a big topic. I think it's being developed as we speak. So if people have other thoughts, feel free to chip in as well. Yeah.
Yes, and Rachel, I see your hand. I just want to say, when we go into developing this kind of roadmap, don't know if we will call it roadmap, whatever we will call it, but definitely that's a big topic that we need to include. Rachel, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to Paris's point. We actually with TBC we developed a guidance around cumulative impact monitoring and assessment. And one of the biggest challenges around cumulative impacts is that there is a very clear and distinctive role for governments and other stakeholders. So it really is about what do you do as a company if you don't have the support and the strategic support of governments and other stakeholders. It's not ideal. There are actions you can take, but there's really, when we look at cumulative impacts, because of the issues that Paris mentioned, we have to have an integrated approach that includes actions from governments and from other stakeholders to make it really robust and feasible. So I think that's something that we're also going to have to look at within the GINGR framework. We've already identified what the roles are, but how do we encourage that to happen, and what are the lessons learned from jurisdictions of doing that, and how do we push other jurisdictions to make that a more realistic and feasible outcome?
And Rachel, while you're still speaking, since you're representing nature here as IUCN.
Well, I really hope I'm not the only one.
But just from your perspective, I would be interested to see beyond compliance, but where do you see the biggest credibility risks if we get the reporting wrong? You know, it stays fragmented. We don't get the roadmap the way that the companies need it. Also, it's very fragmented from a continental perspective. So there are quite some risks with this. So where do you see the biggest risk?
I think the biggest risk is going to be around some of the issues that have already been highlighted around data, around approaches, not necessarily having the same approaches, but having approaches that speak to each other, having data that also speaks to each other, and also, if I'm honest, not putting everything at the foot of companies, but also saying, if we want to have real nature positive future, then every stakeholder has a role to play. And what are the roles for the other stakeholders that will help the companies to implement their roles as well? So I do think that data is going to be crucial. And metrics, which is why the work that's happening within the Nature Positive Alliance is going to be very important. But then, how do you bring those protocols down to the different sectors in a way that allows a landscape view of what's going on, which is going to be really critical.
Yes, thanks. And also we saw that beyond Europe, a lot of the reporting is on the moment on the shoulders of the finance sector. So I also wonder whether there are some risks with this, that the lenders at the moment have so much control over the biodiversity reporting. How can we as GINGR help and shape with this? This could be our role. But I saw that there's you wanna react quickly? I can look at the question.
No, I was just going to say I'm not sure that it's necessarily a bad thing as long as the equator principles are robust. And what we're finding as well, and I don't know whether Paris saw this, is that companies working in jurisdictions that don't have clear regulations are often following the Equator Principles, just because it helps them also in terms of risk if they want to sell the operation moving forward, to have it compliant with some of these Equator Principles also helps as well. So the lenders' implementations are not necessarily always negative. Sometimes they can also be positive.
Yeah, I didn't mean to frame it so negative. Sorry. I just had a quick view at the number of participants. Some are leaving, probably going for the next calls. We have set up a poll, and maybe while we go through the next questions in the chat, Mark, could you please start to share the poll, because we would be very interested to hear from you what would be most useful for your organizations. So please help us answer this. And where is your organization today? This would be very interesting to hear. Of course, if you are not really in the field, you cannot answer this, but those of you who are, we would really like to include your answers in our future work, actually. And then I'm looking at Melinda's question from RTE. Are there convincing frameworks regarding impacts taken into account at the landscape scale, connectivity issues, and impacts of combined actions and measures, or at least recommendations on which actions should be combined to obtain co-benefits? If you want, you can also speak up. Or Paris, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess thinking about the first part of the question, which is about sort of, if there is consideration of landscape scale or connectivity issues. So from the report, we found that, like the lender standard IFC-PS6, for example, takes into account those things. And then if you're operating in the EU, the EU directives like the Birds and Habitats directives have specific considerations around connectivity and species fragmentation, habitat fragmentation as well. Now, for the next part of the question around if there are impacts of combined actions and measures, at least we did not specifically look at that at this report, but I'm not aware of any sort of frameworks doing that specifically in terms of how to obtain co-benefits. On the co-benefits question, for example, one thing that came up was, for example, social co-benefits is one thing that is currently missing, and that could sort of contribute towards nature positive. So I don't think there is much work to that respect, but if anyone has other intelligence, please let us know. And sorry.
Yeah, and there's a next question from Baraka Edward. Many times we encounter obstacles in implementing lenders' compliance because some lender standards, such as the World Bank Environment and Social Principles, sometimes conflict with African customs and cultural traditions. So this is directly talking about people positive here. When will lenders revise or adapt these principles so that they align better with the customs and cultural values of Africa? Have you also looked at the African continent in particular, or was it a bit difficult to find?
We did not necessarily focus specifically on policies specifically for Africa, but we did look at the World Bank Environmental Social Principles, for example, and I didn't know that they necessarily conflict with African customs, but I guess this could be, we mentioned a lot of the positives the lender standards might have, but there are also challenges, obviously, that depending on the context. So I'm not sure necessarily where they will revise, but I guess this is something that, maybe by doing further work for the roadmap is try to get these regional insights as well from other parts of the globe. Because as I said, right now, it was focused a lot on global sort of standards, a lot of EU focus. So getting insights like this will be really important to make sure that whatever roadmap is being developed by GINGR is actually quite representative and also useful to varied contexts as well.
Yes, I would agree. For Baraka, we are actually working with the working group on people positive. It's called people positive, but you can also say community positive. So basically looking at what happens to the people when it comes to new grids and renewable energy infrastructure. So it would be very interesting if we could reach out to you and maybe have a bilateral discussion at some point. Please let us know if you would be interested to talk with us about this. Then I see another that's from Adrian, my colleague. So Adrian, this is a very long text. Do you have a question? Do you want to? Oh, you're at the airport. Okay, you're at the airport. So Adrian is actually representing the GINGR Linear Infrastructure Working Group. And he's using integrated vegetation management. I'm just reading it out loud. Instead of simply clearing vegetation along power line corridors, we apply indicators linked to ecosystem area, ecosystem condition, and ecosystem loss. This allows TSOs to demonstrate how IVM can maintain low-growing native vegetation that supports pollinators and habitat connectivity while ensuring grid safety. So they are spatially explicit, blah, blah, blah. So yes, please have a look. Someone cannot hear me any longer. If you're interested in the work of the Linear Infrastructure Working Group, please have a look on our GINGR website. We have contacts there, and we have a text explaining. Okay, thanks. You can hear me now. That's very comforting. So I'm looking at time now. Please raise your hands if you have more questions to Paris. Other than that, I am currently looking at the results of the poll. So most of you are interested both in practical guidance and a clear overview of existing reporting. So Rachel, this will be then for us to remember. And how you are currently approaching biodiversity on nature positive reporting. So you already report on biodiversity or nature related outcomes. So thank you for filling out this poll. This is very interesting for us. I'm going to close this now. And yes, Mark has actually just shared the link to the snapshot report. This is you can download it, you can have a look, you can reach out to Paris, you can reach out to us. Thank you again, Paris and the team from TBC for this great report. We hope to be in touch and work on this roadmap further. We are actually hoping to learn from this and to see how we can help the sector move fragmented compliance toward coherent, globally aligned and outcome-focused reporting. Whoever is interested to support us on this, please feel free to reach out. You can join our LinkedIn newsletter, the LinkedIn group. You can reach out with questions. We can always set up bilateral calls if you have more insights for us. And we look forward to continuing this conversation. This will not be the last conversation on this. We are currently in touch with the finance sector as well to improve this reporting, and we will come out with more publications in the meantime, and our technical working groups are very active. Maybe Rachel, you want to say a few words on the metrics that is currently prepared by the metrics working group led by IUCN, because in the course of the year we will be able to share some specific measurement tools and guidances. And we will be very happy to get feedback from companies and the finance sector on this. And we will start to pilot the metrics that the GINGR team is doing currently. Thanks for joining. I would, if there's nothing else to say, or if Rachel, you don't want to say anything else, I would close the call today.
I think you've said it, Annika. It's great. Thank you. And thank you, TBC and Paris, for a really robust and really interesting report. Thank you.
Yes.
Really well done.
Well done. And please all have a look. There's a great overview. There's a big table, the table that he just had in a summarized version in the slides. We will share the reporting and we will share the slides. And thanks everyone for joining today.